I suppose it would help if I unmuted myself. Thank you very much. This is the curse and the blessing of Zoom is mute. But I'm really thrilled to be here and share just a little bit about Judaism. From the beginning, and to be clear, I am a Reform rabbi, and so when I speak about Judaism, I speak through the lens of Reform Judaism. Of course, there are a number of different denominations of Judaism, each which may hold different traditions or different beliefs on some of these things, or the ways in which we address text. And I'm happy to take questions about that at the end as well. But I did just want to frame it that way, that of course I speak from my personal experience and for myself as a Reform rabbi. The role, Judaism, of course, being such an old religion, there is so much. And yet at the same time, there's very little in early writings about women. We know that the Torah, our main text, what some may refer to as the Old Testament, we believe was inspired by God, but written by people, specifically written by men. And because it was written by men, it left the voices of women out of the narrative for the most part. So of course, we have some main figures in Judaism, recognizable names: Eve, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Miriam. I'll mention some others in a moment, right? These recognizable names. And of course, they're a part of the narrative, but very little of our text actually focuses on the experience of women in ancient times as it relates to Judaism. So a lot of what we know or what we believe comes from extrapolation, comes from thinking and doing a lot of guesswork from between what's written in there. So for us, of course, the first woman in the Torah is Eve, created from the rib of Adam, taken from Adam's rib. And she was created to be a helpmate, to be a partner for Adam. And this was the way, that women often were thought of in the Torah, right? They were a helpmate to their husbands. They were a supporter. They were the ones who were home doing the cooking, taking care of children. Of course, the ultimate goal of bearing a son so that the generation could continue on. It's all about the sons in that way. And interestingly, I will note this now because later I'll bring it up again, that in the Torah, Judaism was passed down from the father, even though that children, of course, were born physically of the mother. This changed later on in Judaism, where Judaism and for many still believe that Judaism is passed down only through the mother, by the biological mother, because the biological mother, that's where you could prove 100% that the child was biologically theirs. Whereas particularly, before the last couple of decades, there wasn't always the sequencing to prove paternity. So it's only in recent years, in the last about 50, 75 years, that has changed a little bit. And in Reform Judaism now, we again believe that children born of one parent who is Jewish, doesn't matter which parent, and is raised Jewish, we believe that child is then Jewish. So that is a delineation from the rest of Judaism, who still does believe that Judaism is passed down only matrilineally, only through the mother. So it's interesting because, of course, Judaism focuses on the narrative of men, and yet women play such a large role. We have Sarah, Abraham's wife, and of course the biggest question with Sarah that we ask, and in the narrative is we have the story of the binding of Isaac, where Abraham is called by God to take Isaac up to the top of the mountain and to sacrifice him. And Abraham brings Isaac, his son Isaac, and his son Ishmael, and they go on this journey, and they go to the top of the mountain, and he almost sacrifices Isaac, but a ram appears in the thicket and prevents him from doing this. And our question is, where is Sarah in this narrative? because I'm not a mother, but I can only imagine that if my partner took my son to go and be sacrificed, or even somewhere that I didn't know, that I would have something to say about that. I'm very sure of it. I'm sure that any parent, if their child were taken from them to go and be sacrificed, would have something to say about it. So, we ask, where is Sarah in the narrative? Right. And that's how it really tells us that men were writing this, because they weren't thinking about the mother's voice and her opinion and what mattered. Right. They were thinking only about the narrative, for pushing forward the narrative of Abraham and Isaac to continue on. So in the Torah, we do have, though, who we call our matriarchs: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And those are the women who helped to form Judaism along with their husbands, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so they are important enough, informative enough for us that we as Reformed Jews, we have prayers that include the patriarchs, the name of the patriarchs, and we also include the names of the matriarchs. We feel it's important to name not just the men who helped to form Judaism, but the women who helped to form it as well. And this continues on. It's really interesting. There are very little moments in the Torah where you have these narratives of women, and so much of the time they're doing this heavy lifting and miraculous, amazing work, right? We have in Exodus, actually, for us, Rabinder and I were talking, Passover is coming up in just a few short weeks, really, and we tell the story of Moses. Moses's mother, Yocheved, is the one who sees to give up her son and put him in the basket in the Nile and let it float away and have Pharaoh's daughter rescue her, right? But it's Miriam who's told to watch out for the basket, to make sure that he's taken care of. And just prior to him being born, we have these two handmaids who are given very little credit. Their names are Shifra and Puah. And these are the two handmaids who refuse to sacrifice and throw away, for lack of a better term, all the male Israelite babies, right? That's what Pharaoh commanded the enslaved Israelites to do, was to get rid of the male children, because he was so worried about an uprising and so worried that the enslaved Israelites would revolt. And in this act of power and standing up, they said, we're not going to do that, right? We're going to do what's right. We're going to save our children. And they did just that. Truly, truly righteous people. And they're given very little credit, a few verses in one chapter of Exodus, and that's it. The same thing is true later in Torah. And there's very little when it comes to Jewish law, doesn't really talk about women. We'll get into what women observe and don't observe. What we do know is that, of course, land rights were handed down from male to male, right? So through a father, a son, a brother, an uncle, depending on the relationship. And the biggest win for women in the Torah comes in a Torah portion in the book of a section in the book of Numbers. And there's a man named Zelophehad, and Zelophehad had 4 daughters. He didn't have any sons. He didn't have any brothers. He had no male kin of any kind. And Zelophehad dies, and his 4 daughters have the wherewithal to go to Moses and Aaron and to say to them, our father has died. He has no male heirs. We deserve to be able to inherit the land. It shouldn't just go back to the tribe, right? There's no reason why we as his daughters shouldn't inherit that land, should lose out on that land. And so Moses and Aaron take that argument to God, and they talk to God, and God says, ultimately, you're right. They should inherit the land. But I'm going to put a lot of caveats on that, right? So they can inherit the land. And when they get married, if they get married, that land goes to their husbands and their husbands' tribes. And if none of them get married, then when all 4 of them die, the land goes back to the tribe of their father, Zelophehad, right? So it's this interesting thing where there's a small win, very small win, for this one particular case, right? And of course, they litigate it such that it's very, very narrow. And so there's no real precedent to be able to use that later on. And so we count that as a win because, of course, it's the first time in Torah, in our biblical text, where women are really given any kind of right. And at the same time, it's very limited and really limited to this one specific case. And so it's a win, but a small win in that way, I would say. And so, in Jewish text, as we sort of move on and look at later Jewish texts, still biblical text, we come to other stories where women are truly the heroes. These tend to be, though, the later stories, later writings. That is especially true in the book of Ruth and in the book of Esther. Those are two scrolls that we read. The story of Ruth is, of course, that Ruth's mother, Naomi, has sons, and Ruth is married to one of them. The sons die, and Ruth decides to stay with Naomi as opposed to going back to her home village. And Ruth ends up meeting, through a series of events, ends up meeting a man named Boaz and eventually getting married to him. And Ruth is who we know is the first convert to Judaism, the first one to intentionally say and choose that I'm going to convert to Judaism. She says to Naomi, "Wherever you go, I go, and wherever you follow, wherever you go, I will follow you." And we take that to mean that she also would take on the rites and rituals and traditions and religion of Naomi, which was Judaism. Ruth was a Moabite woman. And so we have these two strong women in Ruth and Naomi who are able to make it on their own, sort of without men for a long time. And of course, Ruth ultimately marries Boaz, and Ruth is the grandmother of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David, King David being King David. And in Judaism, it said that the Messiah will come from the line of David. And so we have now Ruth, the first convert, who is the great, I believe, grandmother of King David, who will eventually lead to the birth of the Messiah. So in terms of women, that's a huge role, right? And women, of course, are, give birth, have to play a role in providing the next generation in some way. So too, in the story of Esther, and that is a story, of course, for a holiday that just happened, our holiday of Purim, which was just a few weeks ago. And in Purim, we have two main women, and again, one of whom, sort of the unsung hero, is given about 3 lines in the writing, and that's it. Her name is Vashti. She was the queen before Esther, and the king at the time, Ahasuerus, said to his queen Vashti, essentially, "I want you to come and dance naked as entertainment for all of my men." And she said, "No, thank you. I'm not going to do that. Who do you think you are?" And he commanded her to do it, and she said no. And because of that, she was banished from the palace and banished from the kingdom. It's a real, for a very long time, she was, and in Jewish text, she is vilified. She's made to be this awful person. And the reason that the scholars did that was because they were worried that their wives would stand up to their husbands and that their wives would ask questions or say no. And so they made her into this awful woman who manipulated people and who couldn't be trusted, right? And only really in the last 40, 50 years or so has she been lifted up really as a feminist hero, and the narrative has changed there such that we hold her up now as this hero who said no when she didn't want to do something, right? Consent is a real thing. And she is one of the first in Jewish texts not to give consent, and to make that very clear. And of course, then we have Queen Esther, who is the other heroine of this story. And she's a heroine because she comes in and marries the king because he holds a beauty contest, basically. He creates a harem and holds a beauty contest to find his next queen. He wants the most beautiful person in the land. And ultimately he lands on Queen Esther. And of course, Queen Esther has the secret that the king doesn't know. And that secret is that she's Jewish. And she doesn't tell him because Jews at the time were being treated so poorly. And the king's advisor, Haman, wanted to get rid of the Jewish people. And ultimately it was Esther, with some help from her uncle Mordecai, who stood up to the king and asked the king and said, you're my husband and I love you, and I would like for you to save the Jewish people. And he, ends up saying, yes, I'll save the Jewish people. I won't kick them out of my kingdom. And in fact, Haman ends up getting hung for trying to manipulate the king and get rid of the Jewish people, right? So we do see later on in Jewish text this idea of the women as the hero, a woman who's a strong person. In our Psalms, we have a psalm that holds up a woman of valor. Right. So this idea of a strong woman and who that could be. I don't think that the rabbis really wanted a strong woman like Vashti, who said no and who questioned authority. But to the extent that there could be women who express their opinions and their thoughts, that's what was there. What really becomes interesting, though, is in our what we call rabbinic literature, which is the writing that comes after 200 CE, commentaries on our biblical literature. And there, the writers were really just making every effort to confine women or the role of women to private realms, to family matters and things like that, the home, and not when it had to do with anything public. Women, in a lot of ways, there are different types of commandments that we have. And there are very few things actually that women are commanded to do. We have what we call positive and negative commandments, time-bound and non-time-bound commandments. And very few of those commandments fit what women are required to do. And so the rabbis took that not only to mean that they're not required to do that, but that then they shouldn't do that, right? Which is a very big difference between not being required to do something and not doing something at all. And we see this as it evolves in Jewish practice, what women can engage in or not, and how they can participate in synagogue life. And I'll share a little bit about that later. But they weren't really concerned about women only in that they wanted women to be pure. And when they were impure, how could they get them to become ritually pure? And of course, focusing on, private family matters, taking care of the home, and ultimately birthing, hopefully boys to pass on the next generation. That was really the focus. What is really interesting is that in what's called the Talmud, which is our sort of biggest compendium of commentary, there's very few women who are mentioned, but there's this one woman, Bruriah, and Bruriah is given a lot of credit. She's given credit with knowledge, with the ability to be rational and provide arguments in favor or against something. And she's considered somewhat of a scholar and really held up that way. And, there's one particular story. Bruriah was married to somebody named Rabbi Meir. And Rabbi Meir had a neighbor. In the Talmud, they call them hooligans. And so there were hooligans, and they caused Rabbi Meir a great deal of anguish and pain. And Rabbi Meir prayed to God to have mercy on them, though, that they should die because they were such a pain and causing him so much anguish. And it was Bruriah, actually, his wife, and this is all recorded in the Talmud, who said to him, why are you thinking that way? Why are you praying for the death of someone? Are you basing it on a psalm or something that's written? Because, it's not about the idea that people should die, right? She argued that, when people are sinning, we should pray for them to stop sinning, and not to stop sinning by dying, but to stop sinning by not taking that action, or by teaching them in another way that the choices that they are making are wrong choices. And through a whole long conversation, Rabbi Meir ultimately says, yes, dear, you're right, essentially, right? And very rarely do we have in Jewish writing to say, yes, you as a woman are correct in your opinion. It's why Berea is held up in such high regard, because so many of the rabbis were in conversation with her and sided with her and gave her credit, and allowed her to really hold up this tradition and the idea that women could be knowledgeable in some way. That doesn't mean women were scholars, because of course they weren't, and women couldn't, for the most part, they couldn't read, they didn't go to school or anything else. But they were held up in this regard that, they could have a rational, logical conversation with their husbands and ultimately get them to see their point. So this leads me to thinking about sort of Jewish practice and talking a little bit about Jewish practice and where do women fit into that. So in Judaism, of course, I started all of this out by saying that I am a Reform Jew and a Reform rabbi. And that is very important because in Jewish practice, I'm going to start with Orthodoxy and sort of move on. But in Orthodoxy, and this was true from ancient times up until now, it was only men who could lead worship. Just like in the Torah, it was only men who brought the sacrifice to the temple. Women didn't bring the sacrifice to the temple. Women didn't have anything really to do with that at all. And the same is true within worship. So much so that the rabbis were concerned that women would actually, and of course, we also have to keep in mind that this is written in a very heteronormative belief system as well, right? So the rabbis were concerned and worried that the presence of women during prayer would detract from the men such that they wouldn't be able to focus and their intention wouldn't be there for prayer, and they wouldn't actually fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment of whatever that prayer service was. This is idea that we call it the bat kol, the voice of the woman. And so from that, we see that in prayer, it becomes segregated. There's something that we call a Majitsa Divider. So if you've ever either been to an Orthodox synagogue or you've seen one, either in an image or in a movie or a TV show, they often show some kind of divider, and maybe that women sit in the balcony and men sit on the floor. And maybe that there's a curtain divider down the middle. There's all sorts of different dividers depending on the type of synagogue and the type of orthodoxy that it is. But the idea really was that men should be able to focus and women detract from that. And if a woman were to read from the Torah publicly or lead services publicly, all the more so that would detract from the men's praying. And so that was the Judaism that was practiced and still is today by many Jews around the world. It's a Judaism that I have practiced. I don't particularly enjoy it for a number of different reasons, but it's experiences that I have had. So really what happened was in the early 19th century, Judaism really began to evolve, and it began to not just be orthodoxy. In the early 19th century, we had Jews in Western Europe in particular who were fairly assimilated into the culture, and who were sort of a Jew in the pew and a man in the street, right? That was the saying. And for these people, they decided that they wanted a Judaism that they could connect with more, that the Judaism that was being practiced by the Orthodox was not a Judaism that they connected to. And so sort of in line with the Protestant Reformation, this Reformation of Judaism also began to occur. And so we see the creation really of Reform Judaism. first in Germany and then moved to France and England. And eventually when Jews began emigrating from Western Europe, from Germany in the mid 1800s, that it came to the US as well. And the idea in Reform Judaism was that it is a Judaism that was egalitarian to an extent. It still didn't have women leading, but I think that was less about the ability of women and the idea of women being distracting, and more about the times where women still weren't leading and women were still sort of not really as much in professions. So Reform Judaism, though, became an egalitarian Judaism. Also, though, interestingly, it became a Judaism that sought to look like Protestantism, to fit in the way that the Jews had assimilated, right? So that meant taking Hebrew out and replacing it with German, which was the vernacular, so people could understand what was being said. That meant celebrating Shabbat, our Sabbath, not on Friday night to Saturday night, as we do and as is told in the Torah, but on Sundays, like the Christians do. That meant rejecting a lot of Jewish law, including prohibitions on Shabbat, including the laws of keeping kosher. They said, we're basically going to get rid of all of that. We're going to practice a Judaism that fits with what we believe in. And that also allowed for women to begin to participate in Judaism in a very different way, ritually, than they ever had before. This really took a turn and evolved very quickly once Reform Judaism came to the US. So Reform Judaism came to the US in the mid 1800s. By the late 1800s, something like 90% of all American synagogues were Reform. That is not the case today, but was back then. And so with that came the ability of women to begin to lead. It was a long time before women could become rabbis and could lead in that way, but in an egalitarian setting, women would go to religious school. Boys and girls together would go to religious school and would learn. They could become confirmed, which is a ceremony that was created sort of in lieu of bar and bat mitzvah. Later on, it correlated really actually with high school graduation. Again, another way to feel more assimilated. And so there were these moves so that women could become a part of Judaism in a very different way, but it really took until it came to the US for that to happen. So what also is interesting is that we begin to see that life cycles change and how they're observed. So we have, for us, we do a circumcision, it's called Brit Milah, at 8 days rather, for the boys. And this is welcoming them into the covenant, right? It's the covenant of Abraham, the promise that God made to Abraham, that he would make his generations, if Abraham followed God, that he would make his generations as numerous as the stars in the sky. And for a very long time, there was no comparable event for baby girls, right? Baby girls were born and it was a celebration for the family, but there was no meaningful event. But soon after Reform Judaism really started establishing itself in the US, we begin to see that not only is there a Brit Milah, this bris, the circumcision, but there's also a Brit Bat. This comes later on, about 70 years later. A Brit Bat is a covenant for daughters, right? A naming ceremony. Because what the ceremony is that they are, in addition to the circumcision, you're given what's called your Hebrew name, right? So I have an English name, an American name. My name is Jessica Wainer. And in Hebrew, my name is Yiska bat Shachar bat Yosef Leah. The difference is that in Hebrew, you don't have just a first and a last name. You have your name, could be one name or two names, and then you're the daughter of and your parents' names. And so for me, Harav Yiska bat Shachar, the rabbi, because Harav is that title. Yiska bat Shachar is my Hebrew name. Bat, daughter of. Yosef, that's my father's Hebrew name, Leah, that's my mother's Hebrew name. And so that's how we're known in Hebrew, is by our Hebrew names. This was a phenomenon that started because not so many people would give their children a name that was also in Hebrew, right? I mean, my name, Jessica, is not a name that is in the Torah. My siblings' names, Zachary and Carolyn, also not in the Torah, right? So, and there are some people, of course, who are named that those names come from the biblical scriptures, but so many are not. And so to have a Hebrew name allows us to have that connection. And so now we see that most people will do a naming ceremony regardless of the sex identified or given to their child at birth. So that is what happens with baby namings. We also see this with bar and bat mitzvah, the life cycle event at age 13, which is when you enter adulthood. For boys, that has been for a long time when the event is being called up to the Torah and offering the blessing. It's not actually everything else that you see, reading from the Torah and offering other prayers and interpretations of the Torah. Those are additions that were created later on for the ceremony. It's really the blessing, calling up and reciting the blessing over the reading of the Torah and being called up to Torah in that way. The first bat mitzvah of a woman that we know of, or that we know of in the US, happened in 1922. Judith Kaplan was her name. Her father, Mordechai Kaplan, is the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. And so he decided he wanted his daughter to become bat mitzvah. And that really set off a trend of women becoming bat mitzvah. But it really wasn't until the 1970s or 80s, late 70s, early 80s, when it became much more popular for women to become bat mitzvah. So there's an expectation now in Reform Judaism and in conservative Judaism that all people at around age 12, 13, depending on the congregation, will become bar bat mitzvah. For me, I became bat mitzvah the weekend before I turned 13, actually. And my mother, who grew up in a traditional Reform congregation, who had not become bat mitzvah, she had been confirmed, became bat mitzvah on the Friday night of my bat mitzvah. And so it was a life cycle event that we shared together, because bar and bat mitzvah is something you can do at 13, but you can also do later on in life. It's a ceremony that you can celebrate later on in life. And so a lot of women who grew up in the time when particularly in classical Reform Judaism, they weren't observing bat mitzvahs for girls, are doing it later on in life, and has become a really meaningful part of the synagogue culture and tradition. So the last thing that I want to talk about for just a few minutes is women in the Rabbinate, because of course that's also a part of my story. Women were, for a very long time, were not allowed to become rabbis, for exactly why I explained, because the voice of the woman, it was concerning that, or they were concerned that it would distract the men so much so from their prayers that they couldn't or wouldn't fulfill the commandment of reciting those prayers. So the first woman that we know of who was ordained as a rabbi, she was ordained privately. Her name is Regina Jonas. She is from Germany, and she was ordained, I believe it's 1930. And she's the first woman that we know of who was ordained as a rabbi. And it was not widely supported. It was actually very controversial still, not still, but it was then. But the most amazing part about her story is that the last, I want to say 3 years of her life were spent in Theresienstadt, in one of the concentration camps, where she was, sort of ministering to her people and acting as a rabbi, until she was ultimately killed there. And she is, the moral exemplar of what a rabbi should be, and that even in times of peril and in times of crisis, right, that we stand up and still lead and support our community. And she certainly did that. In the United States, the first woman who was ordained as a rabbi is Rabbi Sally Priesand. She was ordained by the same school that I went to, the Hebrew Union College, in 1972. And she actually tells the story that she applied a couple times and they didn't accept her. I think they didn't know what to do with her application, to be perfectly honest. And she tells the story that when she was accepted, they accepted her under the conditions that they expected her not to finish the program. They expected that she would get married and find a husband and drop out and have a family, and that would be that. And when it got to the time of ordination, the powers that be didn't know exactly what to do, because she had arrived to this point of ordination, and now they actually had to ordain her as a rabbi, and indeed they did. And she has led the way for so many rabbis. She was the first Reform rabbi. Rabbi Sandy Sasso was the first Reconstructionist rabbi in 1974, and then the first conservative rabbi, which is Rabbi Eilberg, Sue Eilberg, in 1985. And then what's really interesting is that recently, in about the last 10 to 15 years or so, there's been a movement in the modern Orthodox world that there are some women who are being ordained as what they call, depending on who they are in their preference, either Rabbah, which is the feminine of rabbi, or Maharat, which is another name for a leader. And these are women who are leading mostly women's minions, women's prayer services. So they may lead within the context, they may be a rabbi in the context of a larger synagogue, and they specifically lead women's prayers and women's experiences in that way. And they're controversial because I, of course, and liberal Jews recognize them as rabbis, and many of their Orthodox counterparts do not recognize them as rabbis still to this day. And they wouldn't recognize me as a rabbi, to be perfectly honest. I have to tell people that, I work with conversion candidates all the time. And I have to preface when I work with a conversion candidate to say, Reform Judaism, all liberal Judaism will recognize your conversion with me, but Orthodox Judaism will not recognize your conversion with me. And in part, that's because I'm a Reform rabbi, and in larger part, it's because I'm a woman, right? And I say to people, if that's something that's important to you, then I will help you find the right rabbi to convert. And 99.9% of the time, they know exactly why they want to convert in the Reform movement, and I end up working with them. But it's sad that is my reality, that's what I still have to share with people. That being said, there's been huge strides for women in the rabbinate and women in the clergy roles in general. It's not without our challenges, to be certain, but it really is such a blessing to be able to lead a community and be a part of a community. And I truly stand on the shoulders of giants. My Rabbi Emerita from my congregation is a woman. She was ordained just a few years after Rabbi Priesand. And she paved the way, and she did a lot of the hard work that I don't have to do, because she did it. Because my congregation knows and understands what it means to have a woman as a rabbi, and that's no different than having a man as a rabbi. And so, is the world perfect? No, and we still, of course, have a lot of work to do, and a lot of strides for women. And that being said, as you can see from biblical times until now, we have made huge strides in terms of having options in Judaism that are egalitarian, that are open to all people, and that allow for all people to participate equally. And so with that, I'm going to open it up for a few questions, and I'll let Rabinder, you can decide how to moderate or what you would like to do.
I think it's fair enough. We're a small group, and so if everyone would like to, anyone who has a question can unmute and ask your question, or if you prefer to type in the chat, that's fine too. Let me start by saying this was absolutely fascinating, and I can sit here and listen to more stories, to be honest.
I have many, many more stories. I had to, if you saw me glancing to the side, I was looking at my notes because I wanted to try and stay on topic, because as I said to Rabinder at the beginning, I could talk about Judaism for days and weeks and months and years.
So what is most surprising about Judaism for you? What did you find when you were kind of growing up with it, or, reading about it? And now, of course, you're a rabbi, but, in your journey, what was the most surprising element for you?
That is a great question. The most surprising element to me, I think, was that, we're not a religion that is, for the most part, that does not accept the status quo and just says this is something because it's something and that's it. We're a religion that really pushes asking questions and being in deep conversation with each other, and maintaining and keeping dissenting opinions as much as the assenting opinions. And the fact that Judaism holds that to be in such high regard, that is a part of our tradition, and that it's not just, some of it is God saying, because I said so. But a lot of the conversation and how Judaism has evolved because people have been able to be in conversation with each other and to say, I understand Judaism to be this way. And so in the modern world, that means for me X. And to interpret Judaism in a modern way, and to continue to be in conversation with the text, and with these ancient rabbis.
Thank you.
I have a question. It's interesting that you mention about how little is said about the different women and their stories, because recently that's come up several other times. Like, I heard an interview with somebody who just had a book that came out about women of the Bible speak. And then the book that I just started today, it's a historical fiction of somebody who lived right at, the change of, BCC, whatever. And that's what she did, was she actually decided to write about all the women that weren't listed, and here, let me write their real stories. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then you said that. So do you know of any good books that actually go through and talk about, okay, here's what we extrapolate out?
Yeah, well, it depends. We in Judaism, we have texts that we call midrash, and the idea midrash means stories. And the idea of midrash is it's reading all the white in between the black on the text, essentially, right? It's studying that. And so there's certainly midrash that talks about all of these women and their experiences. The books, there are some books that talk more about the narrative. Are you looking for fictional books? You're not looking for like fictional, here's what I think happened through story, but more of like, here's what I posit happened based on evidence.
Yes, all of them.
Okay. So my favorite fictional book is The Red Tent by Anita Diamant.
Really? Okay.
Yes. If you that one, in terms of midrash, when it comes to biblical figures, particularly biblical women, is the go-to book.
I didn't make it very far the first time I tried to read it.
Okay.
Maybe I'll have to try it again.
I would encourage you. I read it the first time. I was probably, 15 years old, I think, the first time that I read it. And then I've read it a couple times since, and I think that is Anita Diamant's writing is a really great example of midrash, of thinking about and saying, here is it's based in text. It's based in what is talked about with the biblical women, but it's then her extrapolating, saying, here's what I think happened. Here are those conversations, right, that I think were happening between women during this time. So that is one book that I would say. I'm looking up, there's a couple of other books. One, actually, it's not written by somebody who's Jewish. It's actually written by a woman named Regina Jonas. And it's called Just a Sister Away. And that book really, it explores from a womanist point of view, the relationships of women in the Bible. And that I find that to be very interesting. And the way that she reads that and the way that she talks about that. The other person, and I'm blanking on the name of her book, but there's a woman by the name of Tikva Frymer-Kensky. And she wrote a really great book as well. And it is called here we go. I had to look it up. Good thing we have the internet. Reading the Women of the Bible. Okay. Those would be some of my recommendations.
Fabulous.
My inspiration to become a rabbi. That's a great question, Doris. For me, growing up, I didn't want to be a rabbi. I wanted to be a doctor because all of my family are doctors. My parents, aunts, uncles, grandfathers, all doctors. But growing up along the way, I had some really amazing mentors who were rabbis. Mostly through my experiences at overnight camp, that I got to be very close with them and work with them and see what they do and see the rabbi not on the pedestal of, preaching from on high. And where I grew up, the sanctuary that I grew up in, the bima, the platform or stage, is about 4 feet, 5 foot tall. So the rabbi is really looking down on you there. That's not the case in most synagogues today, but so I got to know rabbis who would wear jeans and sit in the grass with me, and have a conversation as opposed to just preaching from on high. And for me, really, it actually sort of took a turn when I went to college. My dad, who's a doctor, said, if you're going to go to college, if you're going to become a doctor, study something that you love to study. And I said, well, great. I love to study Judaism. So I'm going to be pre-med and I'm going to be a Jewish studies major. And I studied abroad in Israel. And while I was there, I actually turned down an internship at a major hospital in order to intern at what would become my rabbinical school later on. And there, really, my mentor there kept saying to me, let's just have a conversation about this. We're just going to consider our meeting today your pre-interview. Why don't you just go sit in on this class? And he, had these conversations with me and really got me to the point of thinking and understanding about the fact that everything that I thought that I wanted in Judaism, in medicine rather, was actually what was in the rabbinate. And it was through that really that I realized that I wanted to be a rabbi and was inspired to be a rabbi. And I think for me, what inspired me was the connections that I saw rabbis making and those rabbis who really pushed me. I had a rabbi who, when I was 12 years old at camp, told me, okay, today you're going to do what's called Hagba, which is you lift the Torah. Torahs are not light. They're anywhere from 30 to 70 pounds, depending on the Torah. And he said, I'm going to spot you, but you're going to do it. And this rabbi, I was 12 years old, trusted me to do it. And he was there to spot me and he got me, but he had faith in me and he believed so much so that I had potential to be a rabbi. He ended up being one of the rabbis who wrote my recommendations for Rabbinical School. And he's still someone I'm close with. Rabbinical School is a 5-year program post-secondary degree. So after college, the program that I went to is the Reform Rabbinical School called Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. We have 4 campuses, Jerusalem, New York, Cincinnati, and Los Angeles. Everybody spends not in COVID times, everybody spends your first year in Jerusalem, and then 4 years stateside. Unless you're in the Israeli rabbinical program. So it's a 5-year program based in text but not just in text. It's really intentional about, creating a rabbi for the 21st century, which also means learning pastoral care and family systems theory, and how to interact with people and how to lead services and how to study text as well. A very comprehensive program in that way. So I was at the Cincinnati campus for 4 years. I was ordained there and then moved out here and came to Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation straight from school.
Do you have more women in your congregation?
do we have more women? I don't know the percentages. I mean, there definitely are a lot of women who are very active in our congregation currently. Our cantor is a woman. My rabbi emerita is also a woman. Our president right now is a woman. So we have a good amount of leadership. And, I think that more than anything, it's really about sort of, it actually doesn't matter your gender or your sex. And it's really much more about your engagement in the community and how each person can do that intentionally for themselves.
Thank you. So do you do outreach of any kind for people who want to learn about Judaism or anything like?
So we do outreach in different ways, but I would say if you are interested in learning about Judaism, or we do a lot of classes that are open to the public, not just to members. I was telling Rabinder at the beginning, actually, we have a distinguished speaker series that occurs on a monthly or bi-monthly basis, depending. And we bring in speakers who are Jewish and speakers who are not Jewish. Last month, we had Mark Oppenheimer, who's a professor from Yale, speak, and a journalist, speak about the future of American Judaism. And this month we have Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who is an economist. And I have to be honest, I think he's Jewish, but I'm not sure. We didn't bring him in. If he is, it's not because he's Jewish that he's coming to speak with us. It's because of his profession and his knowledge of the economy. So, we do that. We do Hebrew classes that are open to the public, all sorts of different programs. You can find them all on our website, which I will put, I guess a shameless plug. I'll put it in the chat. So that's our website, mbhcreston.org. Certainly welcome to reach out to me and ask more about Judaism as well. I'm always happy to talk to people about it.
Thank you.
Safe to assume your distinguished speaker series is through Zoom at this point, or are you guys?
Yes. We are. No, everything that we are doing right now is still on Zoom. Yes.
Cool.
So, and the speaker series will be on Zoom. I can't make any promises, but given our numbers, I would say at least through May or June, if not further, because we tend to have 100 to 150 people who are attending. And of course we can't have groups that large in our synagogue right now. So you all are more than welcome to join us for those.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, Jessie?
No, just to say thank you, and thank you for being here. And if you all have questions about Judaism, if you'd like to speak with me more about it, please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to connect with anyone and everyone who wants to talk more about Judaism.
Thank you, Jessie. That was a wonderful and insightful presentation. And thank you all for joining us tonight. Till we meet again.
Thank you so much. That was so great.
My pleasure. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.